Hello everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Tonight I invite you to consider the pros and cons of stepping into a new space, starting with the pros because they offer excitement and paint a more delightful picture. Imagine a blank canvas waiting to be adorned with your personal touch. A new space can offer endless opportunities for self-expression, allowing you to create a sanctuary that reflects your unique style of living. I even enjoy the process of unpacking, giving everything its place. When you're excited to be there, every day can feel like a bit of an adventure. But this is where a shift in the narrative unfolds, because beware, for the cons emerge from the shadows, revealing a side often overlooked. It starts innocently enough, with the occasional flickering light or blown fuse, yet these seemingly harmless electrical malfunctions soon morph into something far more foreboding. Maybe it's objects that move without reason, things appearing where they shouldn't, sometimes in the dead of night or in the light of day. The space comes alive. And soon, what was once an idyllic new beginning now teeters on the edge of a nightmare. You're asking yourself, can you protect your loved ones from the unseen forces that seem to threaten to unravel your sanity? Will you stand defiant, determined to uncover the truth behind this haunting or mystery, or succumb to fear? If we embark on this journey into the realm of new beginnings, we have to remember that not all spaces are created equal, and the choices we make could haunt us forever. So, let's get started, shall we? Something weird is going on around our property, and I'm just wondering if anyone else has experienced anything like this. We live in southern Georgia, just a half hour away from the Florida border, and we have a lot of land. Much of it is wooded. We've been here around a year, and we also have lots of chickens, some goats, and a few cows. Our only child, Lizzie, is in college now, so it's currently just me and my husband, Saul. It's a lot of work, but we lived in a small town, crowded apartment complex before this. So we were especially grateful to find such an amazing property within our price range. But why was it so cheap, you ask? Well, the previous owner was very upfront about a tragedy that occurred back in the 60s. A man had killed his wife and 2 daughters before ending his own life, which, yes, is tragic, but we've never been too superstitious. The guy selling it to us was also a skeptic who got it dirt cheap, but he couldn't take care of the place by himself anymore. His kids had all started families of their own. His wife passed away the previous year, and now he just wanted to move closer to his grandkids. Basically, we thought that we hit the jackpot. It was like fate wanted us to have this property. And I know what you're thinking, and no, we aren't being haunted. Nothing strange has happened inside the house, only outside. If a ghost is responsible for the events I'm about to share, then holy crap, I had no idea spirits were so terrifying. Okay, so down to it. I guess the first thing happened about a month after we moved. We had just started feeling settled into our new routines and gotten comfortable with all of the animals when Saul found 3 dead blackbirds in the back of the barn. They didn't appear to have any injuries, so we wondered if they might have been sick. But then we remembered the rat poison, those green pellets, and we thought that's what had done it. We didn't have any cats or dogs, so we thought it would be okay, but we got rid of them after that. A few weeks later, I woke up to find a huge dead possum left on our doorstep. I had no idea they got so big, and this time, the cause of death was apparent. The poor thing's throat was actually crushed. It looked like a massive hand closed around its neck and just squeezed. I screamed for my husband, and he came running. Obviously, the possum didn't wander onto our doorstep and unalive itself, so someone had to put it there, right? We called the police. They agreed the animal seemed to have been killed in place deliberately, but we don't exactly have neighbors or enemies. No one that would have a reason to mess with us, so nothing really came of it. We got one of those doorbell cameras after that, but again, all was well for a while. I know the next one happened in March, because it was the weekend before our daughter's birthday. We drove the 2 hours to her college and went shopping before going to dinner, and then Saul and I drove home. It was around 9:30 when we got back. Our driveway is about half a mile long, and it cuts straight through the woods. Saul was driving, and I was scrolling through Facebook when he suddenly slammed on the brakes and gasped in terror. I looked up just in time to see a large, either brown or black, shape disappear into the woods. Saul punched the gas as soon as it was out of sight. I couldn't get a word out of him until we were inside and all of the doors and windows were locked. He described the thing in the driveway as gorilla-like in appearance and in the way that it walked on its hind legs but leaned on its front. When the lights first hit the creature, it turned towards us just a second before hurrying away, and its face is what frightened Saul the most. Its eyes were big, black holes. It didn't have a nose or lips. Likewise, the mouth was just another black hole, only slightly larger than its eyes. We were scared shitless. After that, we bought trail cams, but nothing else happened for almost 4 months. It was the weekend after the 4th of July when we received a dead armadillo on our front step. As disgusting as it was, we were actually relieved because we should have finally had something on camera, but we didn't. We watched the recording eagerly, only saw a dark shape standing in the distance. We didn't even notice it until it moved in order to throw the armadillo at the door. We found footprints that would look human if not for how incredibly wide they were, or the fact that they only had 4 toes. We collected all the trail cam footage but still didn't get anything concrete, just a few blurry images or questionable shapes. Since all of the other incidents were so spread out, we thought that we would have a while before the next one. But it was only a few days before we found a big, dead snake at our door. Our daughter came home for 2 weeks at the end of her summer break, and on her first night here, we all stayed up late just catching up and hanging out. Sometime around midnight, the animals started going crazy outside. Chickens, cows, goats, all of them. We told Lizzie it was probably just a fox or a coyote, and Saul went out with his shotgun. But she could tell that I was too nervous for it to just be another animal. I actually screamed when we heard the gun go off. I didn't want to frighten her, but once that girl gets started on something, there's no stopping her until she knows every detail. Once I did tell her, she was skeptical anyway, so that was fine. And Saul always was a better liar than me. When he returned, he was so convincing that even I believed he had only killed a snake. I didn't learn the truth until we were getting into bed that night. He'd seen the creature again. I still can't believe how composed he was for Lizzie, but there were tears in his eyes as he described what happened. By the time he got to the animals, the chickens had gone quiet, so he went to check on the cows and goats. When he got into the barn, all the animals were huddled together into the far corners of their stalls, like they were trying to get away from something. Saul shined his light in the direction that they were staring and saw the creature standing atop one of the railings. It jumped down and ran towards my husband. That's when he fired, but it just kept coming and continued straight past him, out of the barn. and back into the woods. He didn't see how he could have missed the shot, but admitted to closing his eyes when he squeezed the trigger. I'm just grateful he wasn't hurt, and that none of our animals were on the doorstep the following morning. We were fortunate enough for nothing else to happen while Lizzie was home, but 2 weeks later we found another armadillo at our door. And the day after that, it was a skunk. It was around this time we got a weird picture that almost seemed like the creature had stuck its face up to the camera. But that was the only one really worth noting, and we aren't even sure about it. Finally, I had to ask, if it's smart enough to avoid cameras, maybe this is a human in a costume after all. What if someone had just been messing with us this whole time? But there's no doubt in Saul's mind. He's fully convinced this thing can't be human. He's looked into the black holes that are its eyes and insists nothing is behind them. It also smells like death, like its insides are already rotting. Sometime after Halloween, we woke up to find 6 blackbirds on our doorstep, and the doorbell camera showed a hulking figure throwing them at the house, one by one. We'd had enough. Saul drove over an hour to borrow 2 small bear traps from a friend. I didn't like the idea, but we didn't have any animals that weren't securely locked away at night, so I didn't have much of an argument. They were left out just after nightfall and collected first thing in the morning, just to be extra cautious, but they only lasted for a few days. One morning, we woke to find both traps had been broken, like they were bent and warped, as if someone tried to crumple them like paper, but couldn't quite crush it all the way. That scared me more than anything else we had seen. The strength it must have taken is unbelievable. Much more than what it would take to chuck a dead animal at our doorstep. We had a nearly 2-month break after that, until we woke up to find another giant possum on our doorstep. That happened just a few weeks ago, so we're probably due for another visit any time now. The randomness of it is one of the worst parts. You just never know when something is going to happen. And it's never what you're expecting it to be. Never. If I go up to the door and peek out the side window to see if there are any bulky shapes on the stoop, nothing will be there. It's only the mornings, when my mind is completely elsewhere, when I'm rushing to get out of the house without thinking that something is inevitably going to be waiting for me. I just don't understand. Even when it had the chance, it never hurt us. Technically, it's never even threatened us. Not really. When it charged at Saul, he'd been blocking the only exit, and despite the fact that he shot at it, the creature still just ran past him. And though it did disturb the animals, it could have killed them all by now. Yet it only kills things in the forest. I just can't shake the feeling that it thinks it's leaving us gifts, like a cat. I'm not saying I want to pet it, I'm just curious. I've never seen anything so terrifying, and I haven't even seen its face. Saul wakes up in cold sweats all the time because he has nightmares about the holes in its face. If I had known that groups like this exist, I would have shared our story sooner. But my daughter only just told me about you all a few days ago. Since then, I've been reading other people's stories while working up the courage to write this. I just don't know if anyone has the slightest idea of what it could be. Even if you aren't sure, all guesses are welcome. Thanks for reading. I can't help but wonder if a spirit is somehow making its presence known in our apartment. It all started when I suddenly felt a chilling sensation on my lower legs. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, and it was as if an icy breath brushed against my skin. It caused all the hairs on my body to stand up, and at that very moment, my daughter comes rushing to me, visibly scared and pointing towards the kitchen area where her little play kitchen is. She tells me it's too scary in there, still pointing to the kitchen. However, she doesn't elaborate, just cuddles up to me and doesn't move for the remainder of the afternoon until lunchtime. The combination of these two occurrences left me questioning my sanity because I felt scared. The feeling did eventually pass, but just a couple days later, something new started happening. The smell of smoke, repeatedly. There's nothing burning in the house, around the apartment. We don't have fireplaces, nothing. But the smell is so apparent, it might as well be happening inside the house. Deeply concerned after day 3 of this, I decided to confide in my best friend about the strangeness. I share with her that I've been repeatedly smelling smoke, as if a fire was burning in my room, even though there's no source of fire or smoke to be found. I told her at first I'd brushed it off as an oddity, thinking nothing more of it, but as the days go by, the scent of smoke returns, lingering in the air of my room. She's not as concerned as I am, understandable, but the smoke smell won't stop. The persistent phenomenon urges me to try and dive deeper into any possibilities. Driven by madness, curiosity, fear. No, it's fear. I researched online the best that I could for all possible explanations as to why I can smell smoke in my room when there's no logical source. As I immerse myself in the research, I get past all the obvious explanations that just don't fit my situation, and I'm led down a more paranormal path. Reading, I'm forced to imagine that it's possible we might have a ghost attached to our apartment, or worse, something attached to one of us. Last night, my daughter was in bed, and while I was busy feeding the dog, something extraordinary caught my attention. I glanced towards the entrance gate to our apartments, which I can see from my window, and there it is, a flickering flame, both big and small, just dancing in the darkness. This next part, I can't explain in a way that doesn't make me sound crazy, but it feels as if the ghostly entity is attempting to convey a message to me, using this display or using fire as its medium. Witnessing this, I'm spinning in thoughts of both awe and apprehension. As I got closer to the window, the flame seemed to grow greatly before disappearing entirely. Now, as a mother, I find myself standing at a bit of a crossroads. I'm for sure unsure about next steps. Part of me wonders if I should embrace this connection and even try to decipher potential messages being sent my way. But the other part of me says that I need to seek assistance in banishing this presence from our lives. The uncertainty weighs surprisingly heavily on my mind. I want to protect my family, provide a safe environment for my daughter. I can't afford to move right now, so what should I do? Any advice would be greatly appreciated as I navigate through this situation. Thank you. Back in 1997, I lived in what I would call a bad neighborhood. It was in the San Fernando Valley, so it wasn't the worst that LA had to offer. The apartment was under the stairs halfway to the back. The rent was cheaper than the other apartments, and I was glad to have gotten it. It was just me and my girlfriend at the time living there. What was odd off the bat was that it had 2 steps from the door to the floor of the apartment. I don't know why, but it was the only one. In this apartment, it was cold almost all the time, despite the outside temperature. The kitchen and living room were open to each other, and the door led to the bedroom. You could see 80% of the apartment from the bedroom. The first odd thing that happened was that night. I could hear someone walking around outside my door, and then knock. Sometimes I was in the living room and could clearly see that no one was out there. A few weeks in, the TV and radio would start to turn on and then the volume would go up. At the time, I figured that someone had similar electronics and that was causing it. It wasn't until a drawer came open in the kitchen and something fell out onto the floor one night. That's when I started to really wonder. It was my knife drawer, and the chef's knife was on the floor. I was in my bedroom. I could see across the apartment, and no one had been there. I started to ask the neighbors, but they mostly wanted to keep to themselves. The next night, I woke up to quiet sobbing that stopped when I went into the living room. The next day, I struck up a conversation with an older resident. I asked about my apartment, and he smiled. He told me that years back there were some gang members that lived there. They used to make noise and trouble, and everyone stayed away from them. One day, they all got into a fight in the apartment and stabbed someone to death. They just up and left him there, and it took almost a week or so for someone to call the police, as it had started to smell. They couldn't get the smell out because it was in the subfloor. The solution was to tear out all of the carpet and tile the cement under it. Looking at the rough cement, 1-foot floor around the whole apartment, it made sense. He then told me there was more. I was like, great. The next people who would live there had a teenage daughter, and she had a boyfriend in the building. They broke up later, and he would watch her come and go with hate in his eyes. Luckily for him, he didn't hurt her physically, but what he did do was hang himself on the stairs just outside her door, looking at it. He knew that she left for work early, and of course, she found him. Later, I talked to the lady that lived in the apartment where her dead boyfriend lived. She said that she could hear someone opening her door and then walk down the hallway towards my apartment. I did not renew my lease after a year of ghosts and the actual dangerous gang members that lived in these apartments. This happened a few years ago. My mother called me to tell me that she was going to have a birthday party for my father. We usually have dinner, so a party was something different. I wasn't really in the mood for it, only because he's a realtor and tons of people I didn't know would be there. Add the fact that the house has a medium-sized backyard with a pool, and the lighting inside sucks, so you're standing room only in the house and in near dark, with a little more room outside. It was all okay. I did my best to be social, but I stayed in the backyard for the most part. Looking around, I noticed a woman with a boy, 7 years old or so, basically attached at her hip. Anytime they caught my eye, he had his arms around her waist so tight and was looking at me blankly. I didn't approach them. I thought maybe he was autistic or not feeling well or something, but it seemed odd to bring him to this late-night party. When the party thinned out, my sister-in-law asked me, "What did you see?" I said, "What?" Like I didn't know what she was talking about, because at that moment I really didn't know. She said, "I felt something in the backyard, but you could see it. I could tell." I said I didn't see anything strange, but then I said that people shouldn't be bringing their kids to adult parties that run this late, especially when the child clearly doesn't want to be here. She said, "What child?" I pointed out the woman, and there was no longer a child by her side. So I said, "I guess they had enough sense to take the boy home." She looked at me, horrified, saying, "There was no boy. That woman, she lost her son a few years back to cancer." I was told later, even by my parents, that there were no children at that party. I drove home freezing the whole time. I couldn't get past the boy's blank expression. Try to rest, little man. This isn't my story exactly, but I heard about it and saw the evidence from those involved. My mother's late boyfriend, who we'll call Steve, grew up in a small town called Oakville. Steve would often take my youngest sisters and my mother to visit family there. He's big on photography, so he was always looking for fun and cool places to take the family where he could take photos. While my brother and I had already moved out, my mom and sisters were still living with Steve at the time. I had already had 3 kids, so it wasn't feasible for me to join them on these trips. On one particular visit, Steve decided to take them to an old mansion called Graywood Manor, which wasn't far from Oakville. The sun was shining, and it was perfect weather for a hike and some photography. After returning home from the somewhat uneventful visit, Steve had the photos developed. This was almost 25 years ago, so they were using rolls of film. Surprisingly, every photo, except one, captured the joyous atmosphere of the sunny day. The odd photo, however, showcased Graywood Manor at night during a fierce thunderstorm, with lightning illuminating the sky. Strangely enough, the negative for this photo was sandwiched between the normal photos that depicted the sunny day. No one noticed anything unusual when the photo was taken. It was only discovered by the person developing the film. Steve kept the photo and the negative until his passing this summer, and none of us could explain the inexplicable occurrence. I had the opportunity to see the photos and negatives myself, and they left us all bewildered. I wish I'd taken it with me. To this day, the mystery behind that particular photo remains unsolved. This is the story of how the aunt I never came to know died. I'm 38 now, but I learned about this when I was a teenager. My dad actually shared it with me when he was still alive, but it's still questionable if that was intentional or not. We were moving from one place to another, and I'd seen a picture that I'd never seen before in my life. I recognized the little boy as my dad, but I didn't recognize the little girl standing with him in the photo. My mom was the one closest to me when I stumbled upon the picture, so I asked her, "Who is this?" She looked at the photo first. I could tell she knew the answer, but then she shot me a look like she wasn't going to tell me. It was a super weird moment of silence before I asked her again, like, "Come on, Mom, tell me who that is." As I said this, she sort of shushed me. I laughed because it was out of character, and then she just walked out of the room. I was so confused, so with the photo in hand, I followed her. It was as if she was literally trying to outrun me. Finally, instead of laughing, I stopped in my tracks and I said, "Fine, I'll just ask Dad." And she came running back to where I was. And then, just as before, she started to shush me. I gave her a look, hoping to convey I was serious. But then my dad walked into the hallway area we were occupying, and he asked what we were running around about and what I was going to just ask Dad about. Long story short, I accidentally made my dad cry. He tried to hide it, but I know he did, when I showed him the picture. And then I felt so bad I left the room crying. Teenagers. So I didn't even get the story until later, maybe 2 weeks later. But by that time, I'd kind of forgotten about the photo because we'd moved and everything was so hectic when I started school that year. I didn't really forget about it, but I'd put to bed the idea of asking about it again. Then one night, we're all watching a movie. I can't even tell you what it was, but my dad paused it, and out of the blue, for me anyway, apparently he'd been building up to this with my mom for a while, he says to me, "I could have prevented my sister's death, but I didn't. I'll never forgive myself. I'll always consider myself to blame. I've never talked to anyone about this except your mother, because there's no question that no matter the intentions, What happened resulted in her death. Now, before you go judging my dad too harshly, I should remind you he's no longer with us, but most importantly, he was only 5 years old when this happened, and he carried this with him his whole life. Certain fears he had, well, they made sense after I learned the story. Honestly, a lot made sense once I learned the story. He was 5 and in kindergarten. His sister was 7 and in the 1st grade. Her classroom was located across the hall directly parallel to my dad's classroom, and the doorways faced each other. All that day, his sister and her friends would taunt my dad from their classroom, make faces, putting the L above their heads, calling him names when he was in ear's range of the door. Just typical sibling drama. Earlier that day at one of their recesses, he'd accidentally embarrassed her in front of her crush, and she wasn't in the business of forgiveness. The bullying continued on the bus ride home after school, only intensified. She and one of her friends from class, they sat in the back to deliver the harassment. By that point, my dad said he'd had enough of it. He turned around and directed a few choice words their way, but that only increased the barrage of insults. And during this time, they lived in the mountains of the western United States, and the houses had acres between the next. The trip home took a little over 50 minutes from school, and he said that they were only 3 or 4 minutes out of the school's gates before she unleashed a bomb on him. She really dug into him with her words, and finally got his cheeks to turn red and his eyes to flutter with speechless disbelief, slowly welling with tears. He interrupted himself to explain that he thought his sister was trying to make him feel the embarrassment that he'd made her feel that day. Well, she stood up in her seat and said something to the likes of, "My disgusting brother still wears diapers because he pees his pants so much." The bus driver tells her to sit down, but the bus full of kids has already erupted in laughter. Even kids in his kindergarten room are laughing. He's humiliated and makes it worse by crying. He said he sat in laughter and ridicule from his peers all the way until their stop. Their parents weren't home yet, usually arriving a couple hours after my dad and his sister got home. When they got to their front yard, my dad, still crying, ran up to the porch and into the house. He quickly shut the door behind him and locked it before his sister could get in. Their doors were never locked, so this just meant that she'd have to walk around back to get inside. Still, he said it felt satisfying to slam the door in her face. He ran into the living room and stood there with his arms folded and a smug look on his face. He was waiting for her to come in through the back door, but then he heard her screams from the backyard. He thought she was trying to trick him, so he cautiously walked through their kitchen area to the back glass door. The first thing he saw was one of the biggest mountain lions he'd ever seen, but his sister was nowhere in sight. Suddenly, the giant cat lunged its head down and out of view, and he realized it was on top of his sister. It was so quick that he grabbed the sliding glass door and started to scream at the cougar, who then tried to grab his sister's body in its mouth to drag her away. He saw a few of his toy cars on the back deck. He grabbed them and began throwing them at the large cat while screaming. One managed to actually hit the cougar, and he thought that's why it dropped his sister's body and jumped back over the fence into the forest behind their house. Within almost the same instant, a neighbor came running over. He was yelling and had his arm above his head. Shortly after that, his wife, or possibly the man's mother, was there as well. The old woman stood in horror as the man attempted to perform CPR. From my dad's current point of view, given his height, he couldn't actually see his sister. As he began to step forward, the old woman called out for him to stay back. Then, she made her way to where he was standing. She told my dad that she called the police before coming over. He didn't really know what that meant, but he thought that it would be good news. he thought the police could for sure help his sister. As my dad sat with the woman inside, he explained where his parents were. He remembers sitting in the kitchen and hearing the woman call his mother. He'd heard her scream over the phone, and he'd never heard her sound like that before. Her voice wasn't angry, she was anguished. My dad's sister was unfortunately already dead by the time the neighbors had shown up, well before my grandparents made their way home. My dad said after that day, he didn't talk for a year, maybe more. He doesn't even remember what made him start talking again, but one day, he was verbal. But he never spoke about what happened that day, ever. Not until he met my mom, at least. Honestly, I'm so glad he told her. I think if he actually had carried that alone, he wouldn't have grown into being the dad that I loved so very much. He would often say that my mom saved his life, and I guess I always wondered a little bit what that meant. Was it just the typical, I was a rebel before this lady kind of thing? It didn't really seem that way, but this story, I think I understood what he meant. Another thing was his fear of cats. It was a really big one. So much so that I've never actually owned one. I suppose I could now, but he was absolutely terrified of them. And he was never an outdoorsy man, which could be a lot of things, but I think this is also a huge reason that he kept us in the city. I told my dad straight up when he told me this that I didn't think he should blame himself at all. It was really just a horrible accident, and he was so young. Plus, he did try to help with his cars and all. Anyway, thanks for reading. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode, but be sure to join me every Friday night for a brand new one. And whether it's your first time or you're a regular, thanks for listening. Your support means the world over here. New videos every Friday. Keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos, and of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, and Adrienne. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining my Patreon, patreon.com/thedarkesthour. Or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour YT. Stay spooky.